Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Best Practices for Shipping Pharmaceuticals to Your Patients, presented by Cardinal Health. I'm Joe Keenan, contributing editor to Fierce Markets, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speaker today is Jonathan Kernia, Director of Customer Operations, Cardinal Health OptiFreight Logistics. You can read his full bio on the right side of your window. Before we begin, I have a few technical notes to go over. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Resources List button at the bottom of your screen. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button on the left side of your screen, and you can do that throughout the presentation. That pretty much takes care of it. I think we're ready to begin. Jonathan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Joe. This is Jonathan Kernia, and I wanted to take a moment to welcome everybody to our presentation today. So throughout the next hour, we're going to discuss best practices in shipping, arguably pharmaceuticals, from your pharmacy. So before I begin, as Joe mentioned, I am here on behalf of OptiFreight Logistics, which is a Cardinal Health company, and to hopefully provide some credibility to our position here with shipping pharmaceuticals. I wanted to give a general landscape of who OptiFreight is and how we service the marketplace. So last year we managed over 17 million parcel shipments on behalf of our entire client base, and we service over 30,000 healthcare locations all across the country. And throughout the year we saved over $340 million on behalf of our clients. It's worth mentioning here that within those 30,000 healthcare client locations, we do have several hundred pharmacy locations that are currently using OptiFreight's program. So we've been in this marketplace and we've seen how pharmacies are acting, and we're looking to continue to move into this market space even more aggressively. But arguably what we want to make sure we convey here is that Cardinal Health and OptiFreight has the power of scale when it comes to leveraging carriers and understanding the freight management process. So moving on to the next slide. So we are all aware of the fact that there's pressures on reimbursements that's causing everyone to be more cost conscious in operating their healthcare businesses, including pharmacies. It is probably pretty well understood that it's common to look at your pharmaceutical spend through your distributors. So think of your Cardinals or your ABCs or your McKessons, and go there to try to target and reduce your cost, your overall cost at your pharmacy. And that's a good place to start. But we also know that over the years, they've been brought down to very, very thin margins and arguably can't move much further to reduce their cost in providing pharmaceuticals to you. So today what we want to talk about is identifying potentially a very simple way to reduce your cost, and that's through your shipping practices, both inbound, but specifically if and when you ship outbound to a patient or to another business. And the upside here is it's a pretty simple process, and we're going to detail it here today. So let's talk a little bit about the healthcare marketplace. Now, again, it's probably pretty common knowledge that it's constantly evolving, especially from the mid-'90s on. From an overall cost pressure perspective, all types of providers, from hospitals to physicians to labs to pharmacies, have continued to be pressed to reduce their costs and provide better and more cost-effective care directly to the patients. What we've seen is a migration of the delivery of care directly to the patient. So over the last 5 to 10 years, the actual delivery of health care is coming out of the hospital and starting to go directly to the patient's site. So further along the continuum of care. Think of long-term care facilities or even surgery centers, ambulatory locations outside the hospital that are providing care closer to the patient. But even more so, in recent years, we've seen a trend directly to the patient's home. You can now receive procedures, and you can receive pharmaceuticals shipped directly to the patient's home, and it's a matter of convenience. And I think there's no question that we're going to ultimately continue to see a migration of delivery of patient care closer and closer to where the patient resides. I think another trend that's worth calling out is the massive amount of consolidation we see across the entire continuum of healthcare. That starts with, of course, the hospitals or the IDNs, the delivery networks that are buying and acquiring hospitals and becoming larger and larger systems. In that process, they're also acquiring physician practices, some of the ambulatory or surgery center sites, and they're also acquiring some pharmacies or potentially starting pharmacies directly within their facilities. And as we continue to move down this progression or evolution of healthcare, I think it's pretty well understood that we're going to continue to see this consolidation of healthcare as these large systems are able to provide the entire continuum of care, from both preventative medicine to acute care to non-acute care to recovery, and again, from maintenance, specifically when it comes to some pharmaceuticals. I know it's kind of a cliche, but I think it's always worth calling out to kind of galvanize this concept. I think anyone that's opened a business book or been in general business has heard the story of Kodak film. For over a century, Kodak was the leading market, it was leading the market in film and film production, and basically had the entire market cornered when it comes to anything photography related. Back in the digital evolution of that marketplace, Kodak refused. And again, depending on who you ask or what stories you read, they were pretty adamant about not believing that change was coming. So in 2012, Kodak, which was a massive blue-chip company here in the U.S. and employed thousands of employees, had to file for bankruptcy, which is a good example of what happens when you're not constantly evolving or picking up market cues. You know, if you don't change and evolve in a market, you're potentially not going to be in a market for very long. So why are we here today? Let's talk a little bit about what freight management actually is. So you likely are working, again, if you are shipping pharmaceuticals. I do want to be clear here. I want to start, give a quick call out here. When we talk throughout this presentation about shipping, I do want to make sure you are aware of your pharmacy benefit payer providers and any kind of restrictions or limitations you may have contractually as far as what ratio or quantity of pharmaceuticals you're able to ship directly to your patient. So if you have any questions about that, happy to help. But it's a technical, we want to be cognizant of the fact that you do have obligations with your pharmacy benefit payers providers, and we want to stay within those parameters. But if you are shipping, you're arguably shipping pharmaceuticals out to your patient. So what actually is freight management? You have that direct carrier relationship, and we're going to talk about those different relationships as far as FedEx or UPS, potentially some local couriers, regional parcel carriers, maybe even some large freight carriers. But it's important to understand that it's your ability to effectively manage your transportation costs for outbound and inbound shipments beyond what the carrier provides as just a delivery service. So what we like to say is it's making sure your product gets to the right place at the right time at the right cost. So what we're speaking to here today as a freight management provider is a non-asset base. We're not talking about the 3PL, the freight management provider, owning the assets or delivering the packages themselves. It's leveraging the carrier network of those, again, FedEx, UPS carriers, and providing additional services above and beyond what the carrier can provide directly. So hopefully this works. This is my first time going through on this format. I wanted to take a poll question here today to understand how many shipments you are performing on a daily basis out of your facility. So you're going to see, I think, 5 or 6 options: A, 0 to 25, B, 25 to 100, C, 100 to 250, D, 250 plus, or quite frankly, E, I don't know. So if we can take a minute, and if you can log in your answer, we'll get an idea as far as who on the call today is shipping out to the businesses or patients. I'll wait just a minute here. Just 5 more seconds. All right. Pretty good results here. So this is very typical. If we take a look across the entire participants today, we're going to see a range of very low amounts of shipping on a daily basis, 0 to 25. It's actually pretty evenly split, which is absolutely anticipated. I also want to call out the fact that there is a significant portion, over 28% of the audience today, that doesn't know or isn't aware of their shipping, which hopefully after today's conversation, you'll have some motivation to take a look into that to see if there is any shipping going out of your facility, and ultimately, hopefully we can help address that. Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about why pharmacies are shipping. So I wanted to take a moment. I break the pharmaceutical marketplace into basically 3 general classifications. Now, I am fully aware of the fact that there's nuances and hybrid models of this, but for today's conversation, I wanted to kind of focus on these 3 specific buckets. You have your retail pharmacies, you have your hospital pharmacies, and you're going to have your closed-door pharmacies. And again, I'm aware there's many nuances within each of those classifications, so I don't want to spend too much time trying to fit everyone into a neat, clean little bucket. What I wanted to talk about is some general themes as far as why we've seen each of these different classifications increase or start moving towards more direct shipping to patients. Obviously, from a retail pharmacy perspective, it's a matter of convenience, right? You're able to deliver your patients drugs, pharmaceuticals directly to their house without them having to come to your actual location. Now, of course, there's some downside to that. The convenience factor is great for the patient, but the downside is you're not having that front of the store traffic coming in to ultimately consume other products within your facility. So there's upside, there's downside, and of course there's limitations all across. Hospital pharmacies. As I mentioned before, we've seen some consolidation in the marketplace in hospitals, not only acquiring other healthcare entities, other hospitals, but they're also getting into the pharmaceutical space as well. And it's pretty interesting. A lot of indicators show that part of the reason of moving into the marketplace was actually for employee benefits. It's the fact that they have the leverage, they have the scale to acquire these pharmaceuticals. And they have arguably hundreds of thousands of employees that they pay health benefits for. So if they control the cost of the pharmaceuticals and delivery mechanism to their own employees, they can help control their overall health plans, which I thought was interesting. And of course, as you start building out those networks, it does make sense that you can leverage your network and your employee network to start profitizing or providing a profit center and actually distributing pharmaceuticals to patients as well. As we talk about, and this is probably really key, and we will continue to see this coming, is that if a hospital is providing the patient care directly and obviously tie back to patient outcome first and foremost when it comes to their own reimbursement, the more scope they have in the overall closed network, which includes both patient admittance as well as recovery and maintenance pharmaceuticals, the better control they have of the entire loop. So they're ultimately able to prescribe and fulfill those pharmaceuticals to patients they've discharged. That gives them better control mechanisms. And we're just on the cusp of this. There will be a lot more advancements in this aspect of overall patient delivery as we move forward in the marketplaces. And, of course, the closed-door pharmacies, as I mentioned, these are pharmacies shipping from business to business. You're going to see this market starting to grow as opportunities growing. So as we become more sophisticated in our medical technology, it's producing more specialty drugs or compounding pharmacies that are mixing these drugs together, providing a greater opportunity for shipping costs, right, from a business to a business. Now, specialty pharmacy or these high-end, potentially temp-controlled or chain of custody required shipments are going to be a big part of what we get into as far as part of the advantages of some of the national carriers, especially when it comes to the research and development or the overall cost to produce these drugs. So, with that said, how much are you overpaying? I know, and this kind of goes back to how we started the conversation, it's easy to overlook your shipping costs, right? Because it's either FedEx, it's UPS, or maybe you have a local courier, and it's usually I don't spend that much in shipping. I'm more concerned about how much I'm spending on my pharmaceuticals or how much I'm spending on my labor costs. What I'm hopeful to establish with this concept or this slide here is that every single shipment counts. Now, there's a bunch of different components that ultimately contribute to what generates the cost of a shipment, and we'll get into some of those as we talk about different methods or modes of shipping. But as each of those contributing factors add up by package, it doesn't matter if you're shipping 5 times a week, 50 times a week, 5,000 times a week, whatever it may be, those transactions will continue to build up and to add up. But I definitely wanted to reiterate the fact that don't overlook your shipping costs if you're currently shipping out to patients or to another business, because those costs absolutely add up and they do impact your P&L. All right, so let's talk a little bit about shipping methods. You're going to see a handful of different methods or modes, depending on how you want to look at this listed here. I'm going to start with probably the most obvious one, and those are your national carriers. That's FedEx, that's UPS. We're going to get into the difference of their two networks a little further on, but I think this is probably pretty well understood who FedEx is and who UPS is. Their overall national footprint gives them a very significant role in our conversation today, because they're one of a few carriers or transportation providers that can basically cover not just the entire U.S., but arguably the entire globe as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits of that. I also wanted to mention the Postal Service, the USPS. I'll probably use those terms interchangeably here today. Now, what's really unique about USPS is that they have access to every single residential address, and they're showing up at that door 6 times a week now. The massive amount of infrastructure it takes to build that network, which was built, obviously, we know, over many, many, many decades, is very unique. No other transportation provider, carrier can replicate that. Trust me when I say that is what other carriers, FedEx, UPS, want and will leverage that as they continue to pursue these marketplaces. Courier services. Now, the word courier could be arguably subjective. I'm going to use it in terms of basically same-day delivery. Couriers range from very local, very small operations, could be 2, 3 individuals that have their own car, and quite frankly, if the city's big enough and is dense enough population, there's foot couriers. There is bike couriers. So couriers across the entire network, depending on what you're trying to accomplish from a footprint perspective or how far away you're shipping, and quite frankly, what type of control you need with those shipments, courier could very well be an option. And this is kind of part and parcel of pharmacy-owned vehicles. You could argue that if you own your own vehicles, you potentially have your own courier network, if you will. So in that, we've seen evolution of, if you're starting to serve patients in a small area and you're able to bring some labor costs down, or maybe once or twice a week, someone runs a milk route across your network or across your community to deliver those pharmaceuticals, you basically implemented or built out your own courier network. And, of course, large freight shipping, or shipments, large freight carriers is probably a better way to say it. This is probably doing large freight a disservice by keeping only one bullet point here, but we're not going to focus on this too much today. What I did want to call out is large freight is defined, at least in transportation terms, as any shipment over or greater than 150 pounds. That's the magic break weight. Now, you can get there in one of two ways. You can ultimately have a very large commodity or very large shipment that is in and of itself over 150 pounds, or you can palletize or combine or consolidate a bunch of small shipments onto a pallet that will be greater than 150 pounds. Now, what's unique about this is it's a whole different network, and if anyone that's driving down the highway or freeway or even anymore just the streets within a city, anytime you see those 16-wheelers, your Conways, your YRCs, your Lone Stars of the world, that's all falls into this bucket that we're calling large freight. And again, if there's anyone on the phone that has a background in large freight, I don't want to insult you. I understand it's a far greater network out there, but we're not going to see too much of that in the pharmacy space. But when you do see it, it is beneficial to know that there's assistance out there to be had. So moving on to our second poll question of today. Now that I hopefully laid out a couple different methods or modes of transportation, I'm curious into what is your primary shipping method? Is it FedEx? Is it courier? Is it UPS? Is it postal? Or do you own your own network and deliver by yourself? And again, we'll take a minute and allow everyone a chance to answer. All right, I'm going to hit the magic submit button. And let's take a look at the results. So 20% FedEx, 37% UPS, so we're going to call 50+% in the national carriers. We have about 8 to 9% in postal and about 20% in courier. So again, I'm glad we took this poll question. It kind of helped galvanize exactly what we are anticipating and where we actually wanted to take this conversation. So if we would have had different results, I may have had to change on the fly. But the good news is that as we expected, for those of you that are currently shipping, a vast majority are using a national carrier, FedEx or UPS, and there is ultimately some USPS mixed in there as well. So let's take a second to talk about how should I ship drugs. And this is going to start at a pretty high level, and then we're going to narrow it down, especially when it comes to the national carriers. But first, and as you can imagine, there's pros and cons with any particular option. But I want to start with mail, or USPS or postal, again, all interchangeable, and that's going to be leveraging the USPS network. Historically, typically slower than, if you think FedEx, if you think UPS, if you think courier, you think a very fast delivery service. USPS typically has a longer transit time. Now, of course, distance does matter, so I don't want to put them at an unfair disadvantage to say you can't, or they don't have options to ship at an expedited or a speedy way, but historically, USPS is not quite as fast. Now, the perk is that, per ounce or per pound, USPS can typically drive the cost out of your shipping transaction. In other words, it's typically the most cost-effective if the only factor you're thinking about is cost. If you're not taking into account chain of custody or speed or cold chain, which we'll talk to here in a second, USPS is arguably a very viable option. The other component probably left out there is the expense of the pharmaceutical as well, which will then tie back to tracking and visibility that national carriers provide. So again, depending on what your pharmacy is trying to accomplish, we often see a mix of both USPS as well as some kind of national carrier, and that makes sense. Some pharmaceuticals will fit into a bucket that makes sense to ship via mail, and some pharmaceuticals are going to require that high touch, white glove type service from FedEx and UPS. And very simply, again, this is probably pretty well understood, but the national carrier, the FedEx, the UPS, it's time definite. And to the point that you can actually select a next day service that's time definite, anywhere between 2 or 3 options as far as what time that package has to be delivered. You have your greater visibility. You can track transactions in transit all the way through delivery, which oftentimes will be required if we have any kind of controlled substance, so you can never lose that chain of custody. You have a higher reliability rate of the carrier delivering directly to the patient who's supposed to be who's supposed to be receiving that, as well as you can close the loop on that chain of custody with a signature required. And then, of course, you have your cold chain. And what we mean by cold chain specifically is talking about temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical. And that's pretty common. In fact, talking to FedEx, talking to UPS, a lot of their cold chain technology and the networks they build were very specific for specialty pharmacies. You have very high value, very sensitive pharmaceuticals that are being shipped across not just the U.S., but across the entire globe. And the carrier themselves had to be able to find a way to help support a very specific temperature within inside that box. So we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, but that technology, including anywhere from how it's handled to dry ice, which results in a hazmat type certification depending on how much dry ice is in there, all of that can be accommodated by your national carrier. So with that in mind, let's talk about two different networks when it comes to the national carrier, and I guess this could pertain to USPS as well, but I wanted to focus specifically on the FedEx and UPS networks. First, you have your residential network or home delivery, if you will, business to consumer, B2C, whatever term you want to use. And there is differences in these two networks between FedEx and UPS. There's typically, if you're shipping directly to a home, a patient's home, you're going to pay some additional fee of some sort, be it a residential fee, and each of the carriers have different names and different ways to assess their fees. But if you think about it, they were built, these networks, FedEx, UPS alike, built networks to maximize the efficiency. What they're looking for is high volume pickup and high volume drop off so they can minimize. Think of it as simply as how many miles they have to drive or how many miles they have to fly. So as we start, and you can either think, depending on how you feel about this, you can thank or hate Amazon for this, but as we start the evolution of home delivery within a transportation network, what it's causing is FedEx and UPS to come off of these mainstream routes, if you will, and add mileage and add time to their routes. You know,
guys, we're
expecting to a home. Excuse me? I think we're good there. I apologize for that.
Stop being in and out. So, Jonathan, it sounds like you're okay now, but we were getting some bad sound. Thank you.
Okay. Hopefully that's better. So as we're talking specifically about the home delivery space, let me check my notes. Oh, yeah, so another piece, as you can imagine, if you're shipping directly to a home, you're going to want the higher likelihood of that resident to be home. So what that means is a typically later or a potential for a later delivery time up to 8 o'clock in the evening or 8 p.m. So when we are speaking to business, or basically just as it sounds, one business shipping to another business, you're going to have the option of both express and ground, and quite frankly, anywhere between, 9, 10 different speeds or service levels that you can ship between businesses from express to ground, and some of those are time definite, some of those are day definite, depending on which service level you choose and which service level you pay for. By and large, between FedEx and UPS, their networks, or I should say the product, is similar. Meaning if you're going to pay for an overnight shipment that's guaranteed delivery at 10:30 or earlier the next day, you can have that at both FedEx and UPS. But how they go to market and the networks they've built over time, that is where it becomes a bit more unique, and that's where they start differentiating between the two carriers in FedEx and UPS. I could probably spend most of the time just carving out the differences between FedEx and UPS, but probably in the simplest terms, FedEx's network of ground is separate from its express network. And what that allows from an advantage to FedEx is that the zones 1 and 2 and or how fast ground shipments within 1 or 2 can be delivered is about anywhere between 20 and 25% larger than UPS. So you can ultimately achieve faster ground delivery at a cheaper or less expensive cost with FedEx than UPS. But again, I want to be clear: the FedEx and UPS two networks or two products are very similar. Just how they go to market is where you see the difference here. So let's talk a little bit about what you actually get with freight management. So now that we've talked a bit about the carriers, let's talk a little bit more about a freight management provider. So if we talk about working directly with your carrier, in this case FedEx, UPS, arguably you've negotiated or contracted directly with that carrier. Again, I've seen personally many different ways in which this has happened. But if you are negotiating or contracting directly on your own behalf, I would, and you don't have the transportation or the freight background, there could be some misses as far as how well you're able to negotiate those contracts. And also depending on your size and depending on your actual shipping mechanism, your account management or how you receive support from that carrier could vary greatly. I'm going to keep it a pretty high level from there because I think anyone that's using FedEx or UPS right now, there's individual reps out there across the country. Some go above and beyond, so I don't want to disparage them. But by and large, the way the network is set up is that FedEx, UPS tend to cater to very, very, very large clients and provide different account management support because they're very large networks. They're very large companies. So it's from a 1-800 support line to a instant self-serve type customer service. You're going to see that from a customer service experience. So if we take a look at what you get with a freight management provider, here's where I like to simply state, you're basically hiring a freight expert. You're basically bringing in someone that knows the freight network and can manage the carriers on your behalf, and that does start with their ability to provide access to pricing. They are leveraging or aggregating their entire portfolio's volume with these carriers to provide arguably better financial incentives than if you are to contract directly with the carrier. There's also the idea or the concept of account management and how a freight management provider services your account. Now I'm going to speak a little bit directly to OptiFreight because this is what I'm familiar with. I've seen other companies as well, is that they provide specific account management to specific channels. So the account management is catered to the pharmaceutical industry. They know the pharmaceutical industry. They know your requirements. They know your pain points to understand how they can work with the carrier to resolve any types of issues, to identify additional savings potential, to identify shipping trends and call it out and bring those to your attention. There's also the idea of visibility and analytics as far as what the carrier is providing from a delivery perspective. What I mean by this is, I would ask, are you familiar, are you aware of what your average cost per package is today? Are you aware of what your average service level mix is today? A lot of consumers of freight don't have that fingertip access, or quite frankly, have the user-friendly, I should say, access to those reports that give you and arm you the ability to be intelligent when it comes to your freight spend. So a lot of what freight management providers strive for in the back end is to provide that clarity and to provide those analytics that give you more access to how you're consuming freight, and you can make more intelligent business decisions going forward. I can speak to, and this is a very specific one, but because I've seen it myself, I think it's probably worth understanding. If anyone out there is using currently, UPS, FedEx today, their invoicing process and how they actually assess for freight charges can be somewhat confusing. Anyone that's seen an invoice knows probably exactly what I'm talking about. I know, again, specific to OptiFreight, what we strive for is clarity when it comes to how we invoice. So it's a very simple invoice that shows very specific transactions, and we put great effort and strides into making sure our clients know exactly what they're paying for. And of course, because of that, and part of the process we'll speak to in just a second, is that does include holding the carrier, FedEx, UPS, accountable, not just to the pricing mechanism, but other audit points to make sure you're paying for what you're supposed to be getting. So I want to reiterate. Using a carrier directly versus using a freight management provider, nothing changes from the delivery aspect. That carrier is still showing up at your location. That carrier is still picking up those shipments, and that carrier is still delivering those packages directly to their destination, be it a patient or to another business. The only part that is changing, when we talk a little bit here about the process, is the back-end piece as far as where the invoice is being generated and how they're ultimately being assessed for that freight cost. So we have a little flow chart here, and hopefully this makes sense. I wanted to really hit this point pretty hard, is that your current process today is you're filling your prescription. So the pharmacy is filling the prescription. The carrier is showing up at your location to pick it up. Your carrier is delivering directly to the resident or to the business, and the carrier is invoicing the freight management provider. This is where it gets. This is where the benefit, and this is the one back-end change that happens between using a carrier directly versus using a freight management provider. As opposed to the carrier invoicing you directly, they invoice the freight management provider. The freight management provider then in turn takes that carrier invoice and audits it and reconciles it if there's any discrepancies. And again, depending on how you need to see your invoice or if you have any allocation requirements, there's several different ways freight management providers can provide assistance to streamline that process. But once the audit is finished, the freight management provider invoices you or the pharmacy directly. And then, of course, on the back end, this is one of the layer-on benefits of freight management provider, is that they provide access to reporting and general analytics. And that's it. That's the process. That's the benefit. You're going to get basically the carrier service as far as delivery with the benefit of a layer on of a freight management provider that has your best interest in mind to drive costs down and manage the carriers on your behalf. So let's talk for a second about how to select a freight management provider. I put together a couple key questions I think are good to equip you with as you're looking, and if you're interested in working with a freight management provider. Some key questions to ask. How much can I save annually? Can you validate those savings to ensure that I'm actually saving what you're telling me you're saving? Is there a monthly cost? Now, again, I can speak to directly how OptiFreight operates. There is no, in our general service to pharmacies, there is no cost to what we provide. But some freight management providers out there do assess a fee, be it transactional or monthly, to provide that service. So it's good to understand what's driving your actual cost there. Do I have a dedicated account manager? As we talked about, the benefits of having a dedicated, well-educated, to your specific market account management or to your specific account is very beneficial. What's your experience in a pharmaceutical space? As I mentioned here today, you need to understand as a freight management provider what your needs are as a pharmacy, what your pain points are, and quite frankly, where you're looking to go next. It's not just where you are today, but how you are looking to evolve. Will I have to change my shipping process? What does your implementation process look like, and can I ensure that it's not going to change how I pick, pack, and ship here today? So part and parcel, can you integrate or how do you integrate with my pharmacy shipping software? Pretty self-explanatory. I think many of you out there that are currently shipping have some form of pharmacy management or some form of ERP system, and you have to reconcile those transactions back not just to the patient but also to the purchase order. So what can you do as a freight management provider to integrate with that? What type of reporting is available? As we mentioned, how do you want to see your freight data? What does it look like? What are the payment terms? This is a very specific one, but some benefits we've seen before is how fast do you have to pay your invoice? And anyone that's run a business knows that cash is king, so cash flow does matter. Again, I can speak on behalf of OptiFreight. Our payment terms from a freight management provider tend to be a bit more generous than the carrier directly. So there is advantage often in how fast you have to pay the provider. How my invoice, as I mentioned, how can you assist me with inbound shipping expenses? We didn't touch too much on the inbound shipping component today, and we don't have a ton of time to go into it per se, but there is advantage in if you have manufacturers or vendors shipping to you directly in managing that freight cost, as opposed to allowing them to assess for freight and prepaid add on the product invoice, managing that freight through your freight management provider can help reduce that cost. And that is a real opportunity and real hard dollar savings to drive there. So typical customer results, as I mentioned, this is kind of part and parcel. If we ask those questions before as far as how to provide it, you would assume, or how a freight management provider operates and what you should look for, you would assume it's tightly correlated with what the typical results are. And again, I can speak on behalf of OptiFreight as meaningful savings, the improved payment terms, the enhanced client account management experience and customer service support. That's a big one. I can't hit that one hard enough to explain what the benefit of a freight management provider is as far as how they operate to reconcile any carrier issues on your behalf, typically more responsive or faster response time as well. That's a big piece here as far as the advantage that the freight management provider provides. Consolidated details in a shipping invoice, I highlighted before. One of the very significant advantages is a more clear and user-friendly invoice as well. And enhanced reporting, visibility, analytics. So you're going to be able to see your freight in a different way and be able to hopefully be intelligent about freight decisions moving forward, not just reducing your current costs, but also identifying trends and reducing your costs moving forward. So some key points to remember: choose the right shipping method. As we talked about before, your different carriers, your UPS, your FedEx, your USPS, your courier. That's the first point here, is to understand their limitations or what you're trying to accomplish. Pick the right carrier. Make sure we're using the right carrier in the right market to accomplish what you're looking to accomplish. Choose the right shipping mode, right? Is it residential? Is it commercial? But even more so, what's the speed requirement? Because the faster a package has to get there, the more expensive the more you're going to pay for that package. So is there a way to reduce that cost by optimizing service level there as well? And then, of course, why we're here today is choose the right freight management provider, the one that can provide the best savings, no cost to participate, no impact on the current process, and basic general flexibility when it comes to their ability to work with you and provide you services. So with that, I wanted to specifically leave some time here at the end. And Joe, if you wanted to, I think we have some questions coming in. If you wanted to ask some questions, I'm happy to take some questions and hopefully provide some answers.
All right, Jonathan, we're ready to move on Q&A. Just a reminder to the audience, there's still time to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We have a lot of great questions already, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. The first question up, Jonathan, is, how do you determine my discount rate? How much will I save?
Yep, common question. So I will tell you that speaking to a wide variety of participants here, I don't know exactly how your business operates, but I will tell you that the driving factor of determining your cost is your volume. Typically, the greater amount you ship, the greater amount you can have leverage with the carrier to reduce their cost. Without knowing, again, what you're currently spending, we strive here at OptiFreight for savings anywhere between 5 to 25%, depending on how you're actually shipping. So very common question, but a lot of components go into it to determine exactly what you can save and what your actual cost is. Hopefully that helps, Joe.
Jonathan, did you get that last question?
I did not. I think you were on mute. One more time, please.
Okay, I'll repeat it. Why do I need a freight management provider? Can't I do this myself?
Yeah, good question. As we mentioned before, what I was trying to articulate here in the presentation is drawing out the value of what a freight management provider provides above and beyond the carrier. You can contract directly with FedEx, contract directly with UPS yourself. The advantage of the freight management provider adds that additional layer of service. And again, depending on which freight management provider you choose, you could ultimately leverage their position with the carrier to ideally reduce your cost above and beyond what you can do yourself.
Do I have to be a Cardinal Health customer?
That's probably the most common question to receive. No, So I can speak to OptiFreight specific. We are distributor agnostic. To utilize OptiFreight, you do not have to use Cardinal pharmaceutical distribution or any other part of Cardinal. We are a standalone entity within Cardinal, and no direct correlation or direct requirement to use Cardinal otherwise.
Jonathan, do you get paid based on percentage of what you save?
That's a good question. So I'm going to speak again on behalf of OptiFreight. There's going to be other providers out there that potentially have a different mechanism. Another way to ask that question is, OptiFreight, Jonathan, how is your company compensated? So the model we've ultimately decided to put in marketplace is, we have leverage and we have pricing established with the carrier directly, and in turn we pass on that majority of that discount directly to our clients. And the difference between what our clients receive versus what OptiFreight gets directly from the carrier, that delta, that margin is OptiFreight's operating margin. So it's that simple. There's no additional cost. There's no additional fees for how OptiFreight operates. And again, I'm speaking on behalf of how OptiFreight goes to market. There's other providers out there that may do things slightly different.
Do you only consider refrigeration temperatures, or do you also evaluate room temperatures when shipping?
You can. That's a good question. So cold chain, going back into temperature-sensitive packages. I will tell you the refrigerated packages are what you need to typically maintain. Well, I shouldn't say that. Ambient temperature you need to maintain too. But the cold chain concept with the dry ice or the ice packs in the coolers, to rate it out at 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, that's important. But I think the question that was also getting to, ambient temperature does matter. Even packages or shipments or pharmaceuticals that do not need to maintain a certain below freezing or below ambient temperature level still need to not exceed a certain ambient temperature as well. Otherwise, that pharmaceutical can expire. So there is mechanisms and there's ways to track the actual temperature within that package with real-time reporting, so we can ultimately identify, did it stay within the band, did it stay within the scope, is this pharmaceutical still viable? So that's a great question.
Can you discuss a little bit about how do you qualifying freight companies according to good distribution practices?
Yeah, I think hopefully I answered the question the way it's intended to. So if you're talking about as a distributor or as a pharmaceutical distributor, maybe, Joe, maybe you want to read that one more time, make sure I understand what we're trying to get to here.
How about qualifying freight companies according to good distribution practices?
Okay. Yeah, so we have to understand, I'll take a step back and kind of delineate. This makes sense, hopefully, in the fact that when I answered, you do not have to be a Cardinal distribution client to utilize OptiFreight. Distribution and freight management, even though they're both transportation related, are basically complementing each other on different sides of the spectrum. So distribution and how you go to market as far as low unit of measure, or how you're shipping or how you're procuring pharmaceuticals and getting to them where they need, versus the freight management provider that supplements through the national carriers, your FedEx and UPS, those services outside of the distribution model. So to answer your question, there's going to be cases where it makes more sense to use a national carrier, FedEx, UPS, to deliver your product, to deliver your pharmaceuticals, as opposed to trying to deliver through the distribution model. Now, I'd have to say, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, depending on sensitivity of, or quite frankly, time requirements for those shipments, will determine which is the best option. But I want to be clear, distribution and freight management complement each other. They're not in direct competition of each other. So hopefully that helps, Joe.
Here's one. Do all prescription deliveries require a signature on receipt from the patient?
Good question. I'd say no, by and large. Now, of course, I'll cite back to, you're going to know your pharmaceuticals and what you're shipping better than I do from my position right now. But your generics and your less expensive pharmaceuticals can be shipped and can be held at locations without signature required. But that's just from my perspective right now. I wouldn't want anybody to make a business decision until we know exactly what you're shipping and consult with, a freight management provider to understand what the best mechanism is.
All right, John, it looks like we're coming up on our last question. Had a lot of great questions today, but couldn't get to them all. We will be getting back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. So the last question is, in terms of, can you discuss a little about shipping from distributors to pharmacies?
Sure. So that's we're gonna take a look at that. As far as your bulk shipment, so that's going to fall back into, Joe, that business-to-business network I was speaking to before, and ultimately, because I'd argue, or at least based on I think where the question was going, higher volumes of transactions. So you have a single pickup location delivering or shipping to a single delivery location, and I would argue probably more than a single pharmaceutical or a single package. So this is where you're going to get into that network I mentioned before as far as the ability to potentially palletize or consolidate freight. You can ship large freight, use LTL or large, less than truckload for packages over 150 pounds. And you can supply or however your relationship is from a distribution to that pharmacy. You can provide those deliveries in bulk at a much, much more cost-effective price than shipping individual packets via small parcel. Now, there are some nuances in there, but that's the general concept here as far as a business-to-business approach goes. Now, within that network as well, from a FedEx UPS perspective, when you're shipping from B to B, there's also the ability to use the more time-sensitive or expedited services, and that's your overnights. So depending on how your pharmacy is required to receive packages, you can stagger for deliveries from an 8:30 guaranteed delivery to 10:30 in the morning to before 4 o'clock in the afternoon for next day delivery. So multiple different components there. But I think what I want to highlight there with that response is from business to business, distributor to pharmacy, there is potential for consolidation to reduce your cost.
All right, that should wrap up our Q&A session. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this Fierce Markets webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speaker for participating and Cardinal Health for presenting the webinar. A reminder, the webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.